Good morning. The Subcommittee on State Foreign Operations and Related Programs will come to order. I'd like to start by welcoming our distinguished panel, Leo Martinez-Diaz from the Department of State, Matthew Harsiger from the Department of Treasury, Jeffrey Haney from the U.S. Agency for International Development, and Jake Levine from the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation. We appreciate your time and your service, and thank you all for being here. Now, this hearing is fully virtual. We must address a few housekeeping matters first. For today's meeting, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute participants' microphones when they are not under recognition for the purpose of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves. If I notice that you have not unmuted yourself, I will ask you if you would like the staff to unmute you. If you indicate approval by nodding, staff will unmute your microphone. I remind all members and witnesses that the 5-minute clock still applies during the question and answer period. If there is a technology issue, we will move to the next member until the issue is resolved, and you will retain the balance of your time. You will notice a clock on your screen that will show how much time is remaining. At 1 minute time remaining, the clock will turn to yellow. At 30 seconds remaining, I may gently tap the gavel to remind members that their time is almost expired, and I might just raise my finger and say 1 minute left. When your time has expired, the clock will turn red, and I will begin to recognize the next member. After the panel presents their testimony, we will follow the order of recognition set forth in the House rules, beginning with the chair and ranking member. Then members present at the time the hearing is called to order will be recognized in order of seniority. And finally, members not present at the time of the hearing is called to order. Finally, House rules require me to remind you that we have set up an email address to which members can send anything they wish to submit in writing at any of our hearings or markups. That email address has been provided in advance to your staff. So once again, thank you everyone for joining us for this important hearing on global climate finance and combating climate change. Again, I want to welcome our esteemed witnesses, Leo Martinez-Diaz from the Department of State, Matthew Harsiger from Department of Treasury, Jeffrey Haney from the U.S. Agency for International Development, and Jake Levine from the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation. Climate change is often framed as a threat in the distant future, but the science is very clear. If climate change is not tackled now and in the most urgent manner possible, we will have done irreversible harm to our environment and to future generations. Just as the pandemic has revealed issues of racial injustice and inequity within public health, climate change also negatively impacts vulnerable and marginalized communities disproportionately. And those who are already experiencing tough conditions only see things worsening, with droughts and floods destroying food security in already fragile, impoverished areas. Economic livelihoods gradually eroding with changing landscapes and increased conflict and instability due to shifting resources and simmering social tensions that expose women, children, and other vulnerable people to exploitation and violence. Climate change is a direct threat to every investment made by the State Foreign Operations Bill, our bill, natural resources, food security, global health, human rights and governance, and peace building. And so I'm so glad that the Biden-Harris administration has realized this urgency and is putting addressing climate change as at the center of United States diplomatic and financial priorities. The International Climate Finance Plan released last month announced the intention to double by 2024 United States annual public climate financing to developing countries relative to what we were providing in 2016. While much of our development and humanitarian achievements are threatened by climate change, the programs within the state foreign operations jurisdiction are central to driving progress against those threats. Any climate change strategy has to work globally with countries and communities, as well as the international bodies that challenge governments to do more and raise their ambitions. We need to understand the various tools within the global climate architecture and how these different pieces combine for a comprehensive and effective approach. Therefore, our witnesses today are the right people to share their agencies' respective roles in the climate agenda bilaterally and multilaterally, and to inform our committee how we can support these efforts. Through the Department of State and USAID, the United States provides bilateral climate assistance and partners with international organizations on adaptation and mitigation programs. These programs assist communities adjusting to changing weather patterns, as well as to protect the landscapes that help reduce pollution and allow wildlife to thrive. The Department of Treasury will be critical in coordinating multilateral efforts on climate action at the World Bank and other financial institutions. The DFC will mobilize private sector financing into climate-focused investments in countries with the least ability to cope. These efforts will help reestablish U.S. leadership on climate change, as well as revitalize our partnership in the global community. I'm specifically interested in how we ensure women and youth are part of our climate efforts. Women are frequently excluded from this conversation despite being the most active in their local communities and dealing with the impacts on their personal household. And so excuse me, I want to make sure that we include women in our climate change discussion, because it's so critical to creating a bottom-up effort that starts from within families and communities. Further, it's our children and youth who face the inevitable consequences if we fail to act. It's crucial that we educate our young people to understand the complexities of this issue and equip them with the knowledge and skills to carry this responsibility. So thank you all for being here and for your agency's leadership on these issues. And I'd like to turn now to my friend, our ranking member, Mr. Rogers, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Today's hearing allows us to discuss whether President Biden's promise to put climate change at the center of American diplomacy, whether that's consistent with his promise to carry out a foreign policy for the middle class. I'm deeply concerned that, far from supporting the middle class, advancing a Green New Deal, both at home and abroad, will destroy more jobs in Kentucky and throughout the United States. Just a few short years ago, the Obama administration undertook a full-out assault on domestic energy and production and consumption. Perhaps nowhere in the country the impact more harshly felt than in the heart of Appalachia, eastern Kentucky district. Sure. President Obama went on an aggressive and unabashed regulatory rampage, systematically hammering nails into the coffin of our domestic coal industry. In my district alone, we lost 13,000 mining jobs in what seemed like the blink of an eye. 13,000 just in my district. For every one of these jobs, 3 more downstream were wiped out as well. It was devastating and still is. While many in coal country struggled to find work and put food on the table, President Obama pledged $3 billion to implement policies in other countries that would only exacerbate their economic challenges at home. It may seem like a long time ago, Madam Chair, but we must not forget what the true costs are for these kinds of radical environmental policies. Now, President Biden has promised to make good on the commitments made by his former boss and far more. The president's aggressive climate policy goals including his return to the unattainable mandate of the Paris Agreement, make the far-left Obama-era policies look weak. The United States economy will suffer while China and other top polluters and competitors can do whatever they like under this deeply flawed agreement. American workers stand to lose the most, and it could not come at worse times as families struggle to hang on from the unprecedented economic hardships caused by the pandemic. Internationally, the president has said he will put climate change at the centerpiece of U.S. foreign and development policy. This is demonstrated in the fiscal 22 budget request that features $2.5 billion for these purposes, including $1.25 billion for the Green Climate Fund. At a time when countless crises around the globe present immediate threats to our own security and that of our allies, this funding proposal is misguided and irresponsible at best. It would also serve us well to remember this comes at a time when foreign aid is under great scrutiny from the American public. Proposing such a significant sum of taxpayer funding for international climate change programs while families and communities struggle to make ends meet adds insult to injury. Madam Chair, I know we all want to work together to advance American national security. In this budget season, setting strategic priorities for the resources made available will be key to achieving that goal. I urge the administration to re-examine the priorities they have put forward and focus on the immediate and growing challenges that are testing United States foreign policy every day. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Okay, I think our statement, his opening statement, and now we'll go to our witnesses. Senior Advisor Leo Martinez Diaz, Deputy Assistant Secretary Matthew Harsiger, Acting Director Jeffrey Haney, and Chief Climate Officer Jake Levine. Let me ask you each to please summarize your oral statements in less than 5 minutes. Want to make sure we have enough time to get to our questions. Your full statement will be included in the record. After your testimony, I will be calling on members based on seniority of the members that were present when the hearing was called to order, alternating between majority and minority members. I will then recognize any remaining members in order of their appearance. Each member is asked to keep their questions to within 5 minutes per round. And given the number of witnesses, it would be helpful if you can indicate to whom you are directing your questions. So, Mr. Martinez Diaz, please proceed.
Thank you very much. And good morning, Chairwoman Lee, Ranking Member Rogers, and members of the subcommittee. The climate crisis represents an existential threat to the security and prosperity of communities in the United States and around the world. At the same time, responding to the climate crisis offers one of the greatest opportunities in history for innovation, sustainable economic growth, and the creation of high-paying jobs. This is why the Biden administration has made tackling this crisis a top priority. Enabling bold action to reduce emissions and build resilience against the impacts of climate change will require mobilizing and aligning finance on a large scale. Let me say what I mean by climate finance in this context. Here, what we're talking about is the provision or mobilization of financial resources to help developing countries reduce or avoid greenhouse gas emissions and build resilience to the impacts of climate change. Now, the case for the United States to provide and mobilize international climate finance is compelling. First, avoiding the worst impacts of climate change does not just depend on the efforts of the United States. We can only be successful if other countries join our efforts. Climate finance can help unlock deep reductions in other countries' emissions by supporting the deployment of existing clean energy technologies, protecting biodiversity, forests and wetlands, and fostering new technologies to accelerate the transition to a net zero emissions global economy. Second, meeting U.S. international climate finance pledges is crucial for preserving trust in U.S. leadership. Third, international climate finance is also an investment in our own national and economic security. Climate finance supports the most climate vulnerable people and countries in the world to prepare for, adapt to, and recover from the impacts of climate change. This can reduce the risk of resource competition, of conflict, of displacement of people, all of which can undermine national, regional, international, and economic security. Fourth, climate finance helps protect and advance long-standing international development goals, including reducing poverty, conserving nature, improving human health, safeguarding food security, and promoting sustainable economic growth. The United States has invested hundreds of billions of dollars over decades to advance these goals around the world, as Chairwoman Lee observed earlier. Because climate change will put at risk all of these dimensions of human well-being, financing resilience to climate impacts will be essential to protect past investments in human development. And in the context of the global pandemic, climate finance can contribute to helping countries restore growth and build back better through low-carbon resilient recovery. And finally, the United States recognizes that in achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement, we must work together toward economic revitalization and making investments that prioritize workers across industries and communities and develop the industries of the future. There's a crucial link between clean energy deployment and investments in climate resilience on one hand, and expanding well-paying jobs in the United States on the other. Exports of low-carbon and climate resilience technologies and related services can be a catalyst for economic job growth here at home. By advancing global efforts to address climate change, climate finance will open up opportunities for the U.S. private sector to pioneer financial and technological and natural pathways for decarbonization. In view of all of this, President Biden has made several announcements at the latest climate summit just last month. The U.S. intends to double the climate finance it provides relative to the Obama-Biden peak years of 2013 to 2016 by fiscal year 24. As part of that pledge, the U.S. intends to triple the adaptation finance it provides relative to the same baseline. This will mean significant new funding for vulnerable countries, including least developed countries and small island developing states. For the Green Climate Fund, the President's FY22 budget requests $1.25 billion. And finally, in addition to how much we are providing in climate finance, the summit also addressed how we provide it. As part of that, the summit, we made public the first ever U.S. climate finance plan. And this plan will focus on the quantity and the quality of international climate finance. We look forward to working with the members of the subcommittee to achieve this vision and fund these vital programs. America's future prosperity, security, and international influence will depend in large part on our ability to confront this crisis. The subcommittee has a long history of working in a bipartisan fashion to confront global challenges. And this challenge is one of the most important. Smart, efficient deployment of U.S. climate finance will help us deliver substantial benefits for U.S. taxpayers. Thank you for holding this timely and important hearing. We look forward to listening to your views and to answering any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Martinez-Diaz. Mr. Harsiger, please proceed.
Thank you very much, and good morning, Chairwoman Lee, Ranking Member Rogers, and members of the committee. The United States and the world face a profound climate crisis. To keep a limit of 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming within reach, the Biden-Harris administration has committed to robust and ambitious climate action that creates good jobs, fosters opportunity in markets for American goods and services, and builds a cleaner and more prosperous future. I am pleased to appear before you today to discuss the U.S. International Climate Finance Plan and the Treasury Department's role in using climate finance to support developing countries' efforts to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and build resilience to the negative impacts of a warming planet. In response to the executive order on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad, Treasury and interagency partners developed the U.S. International Climate Finance Plan. As the world's largest economy, the United States can and must play a key role in the global effort to mobilize climate finance, especially to protect the world's poorest and most vulnerable communities and expedite their transitions to a cleaner, more sustainable and prosperous future. For such countries, smart and ambitious climate action is necessary to protect livelihoods and enable sustainable economic growth. This plan provides the US government with a strategic vision and covers 5 areas. First, scaling up climate finance and enhancing its impact. Second, mobilizing private sector finance. Third, taking steps to end international official financing for carbon-intensive fossil fuel-based energy. Fourth, making capital flows consistent with low-emissions climate-resilient pathways. And fifth, defining, measuring, and reporting on international climate finance. Treasury is focusing the full range of its tools and expertise to increase the US government's international climate finance ambition. Our leadership role in the multilateral development banks, or MDBs, and climate funds enables us to operate effectively to deliver action across the 5 pillars of the plan. We are also working with partners to facilitate increased flows of private climate-aligned finance, which is of key importance to the plan and vital for large-scale transformative climate action. And let me discuss briefly in more detail the key avenues through which Treasury is currently working. In 2019, the MDBs, in which the US is a member, committed $36.6 billion in climate finance and mobilized an additional $43.7 billion, including $22.5 billion from private sources. Treasury staff are engaging with partners to urge that the MDBs implement ambitious climate finance targets and policies, and to support additional private sector financing for quality infrastructure development that incorporates economic, social, and governance standards. For example, the MDBs are assisting countries in improving their nationally determined contributions towards combating climate change, financing energy installations and transmission, and providing risk insurance products to the private sector to support investments in developing markets. Regarding the multilateral climate funds, I am acting as the US representative on the boards of the Green Climate Fund, the Climate Investment Funds, and the Global Environment Facility, which channel resources to the MDBs and other entities to help developing countries reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, build resilience to climate change, and overcome environmental challenges. And each of these funds has its own comparative advantage. The Green Climate Fund is linked to the Paris Agreement and works to foster climate-resilient development and zero-emission investment across a variety of sectors, including transport, water, energy, and land use. The GCF also provides grants or equity loans and technical assistance to mobilize public and private finance at scale. The Climate Investment Funds, or CIFs, help to scale transformational climate finance programs working through the MDBs. The Clean Technology Fund, which is one of the CIFs, is launching a new program to help high-emitting developing countries transition away from coal-based economies and energy production, a goal of strategic value to US global climate efforts. And the Global Environment Facility supports actions in developing and transitional countries to address global environmental challenges in 5 areas: biodiversity, chemicals and waste, climate change, land degradation, and international waters. And Treasury made other contributions to the climate finance plan related to our role in OECD export credit negotiations, the Tropical Forest and Coral Reef Conservation Act, our work to encourage the IMF to include climate risk into its work, and our bilateral technical assistance program. And also in response to the significant and growing demand from the private sector for climate-aligned investments, Treasury is also supporting efforts to improve the information available to financial institutions and investors as they make decisions about where and how to invest. This includes co-chairing the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, which is developing a climate-focused sustainable finance roadmap and working to identify ways to further advance sustainability disclosure and reporting. Thank you very much.
Chairwoman Lee, Ranking Member Rogers, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify about the important role the U.S. Agency for International Development plays in mobilizing climate finance and addressing the climate crisis. The United States is leading by example. President Biden recently announced a bold commitment to reduce U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. However, approximately 85% of global emissions come from outside of our borders, and about 2/3 of global emissions come from the developing countries. To avert climate catastrophe, we must work closely with partner countries to support their efforts to dramatically reduce emissions. This will require large-scale investments to transform economies and reshape energy, food, and transportation systems. But even our most ambitious emissions reduction efforts will not change the stark reality that the impacts of climate change are already happening. The climate crisis is sowing instability and threatening to undo the progress we've made and the taxpayer dollars we've invested in global development, prosperity, and security. In the developing world, about 2.5 billion people, more than 1/3 of the world's population, depend on climate-sensitive activities like agriculture and fisheries for their livelihoods. From flooding to droughts and famine, the most vulnerable groups are being hit the hardest. What will these people do, and where will they go if climate change dries up their livelihoods and opportunities? Globally, we can only achieve our climate objectives if we mobilize funding from all sources, public and private, global and local, and guide those investments to the most effective solutions and to the most vulnerable communities. But climate change is not just an existential threat. It's a major strategic opportunity for the U.S. A global green economy offers a massive investment opportunity for U.S. businesses, new markets for American science and technology, and new jobs in cutting-edge sectors. In the countries where USAID works, there are significant barriers to investment and achieving the promise of a green recovery. Weak governance, lack of regulations, low government capacity to access international climate finance opportunities, and meet investment requirements. USAID works on the ground with partner countries, local communities, and the local and international private sector to overcome these barriers, mobilize investment, and drive transformative change. Let me give you a few examples of how USAID works to mobilize climate finance. USAID supported the government of Colombia's first ever renewable energy auction that attracted $2 billion in expected private investment for new large-scale renewable energy plants, including $255 million of U.S. investment. Since 2017, USAID has mobilized over $13 billion for renewable energy projects through auction support. In Vietnam, USAID's Payment for Forest Environmental Services program has helped generate approximately $720 million in domestic revenue to support the protection of roughly 6 million hectares of national forest. That's approximately 42% of Vietnam's total forest cover. In climate vulnerable Pacific Island countries, USAID's technical assistance helped build institutional capacity to secure $10.4 million in climate change related grants from the Green Climate Fund and is supporting another $200 million in the pipeline. USAID's resilience and disaster risk reduction programs provide an enormous return on investment by reducing the cost of climate shocks and stresses on communities. USAID's climate change investments in the developing world have direct impact here at home. We face a huge challenge, but we have never backed down from leading the world on solutions to tough challenges. We can succeed if we work now to address the risks. If we ignore them, we are willingly increasing our own risk and missing huge opportunities. As we look to build back our economy and recapture our position from China as a leader in global manufacturing and clean energy, USAID is helping to open the world's most rapidly expanding markets for those goods and services. As we work to better address core drivers of migration, USAID is working across the globe to mitigate key climate-induced stresses driving people from their communities. And as we continue to recover from a record-breaking year of extreme weather events here in the US and severe droughts in some parts of the country, we note that climate change knows no borders. Failure to act globally means dire impacts locally. USAID is using all of the tools at our disposal in partnership with the interagency to accelerate the scale and impact of our climate change adaptation and mitigation efforts to meet the urgency of this great challenge. Thank you to the subcommittee and Congress for your support of USAID's programs, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Haney. Now our final witness will be Mr. Levine.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, Ranking Member Rogers, members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today and discuss with you the role of the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, the DFC, in carrying out the Biden administration's climate finance agenda. Climate change is not only an urgent crisis, but it also represents a once-in-a-generation chance to build anew and to build better. The United States' vision for climate action is driven by the extraordinary opportunity it represents for global economic revitalization and equity, for job creation, healthier communities, and racial justice. There is currently a significant financing gap for climate solutions in the developing world. DFC has the power to help close this gap by deploying its financial tools to catalyze private sector investment in a clean energy transition that will create more just outcomes and position American companies and values at the forefront of the greatest economic opportunity of our time. DFC steps in to help fill the need for financing that would otherwise go unmet by private investors alone. DFC's tools include direct loans and project finance, insurance, equity investments, investments in emerging market private equity funds, and technical assistance funding. DFC has built a portfolio that lays a foundation for our ambitious climate finance goals, with more than $5 billion of investments already deployed in renewable energy, and a growing portfolio of food security and agriculture projects. One illustrative example is the 100-megawatt Kipeto wind power project in Kenya's Rift Valley, which is scheduled to be fully operational this July. It is the second largest wind power project in Kenya, with the capacity to supply power to approximately 250,000 households. We are positioned to do much more, and we have made several new commitments. DFC will expand its support for climate-linked projects so they account for at least 33% of new investments beginning in fiscal year 23, and DFC's portfolio will be net zero for climate emissions by the year 2040. We will update our roadmap for impact to prioritize climate-focused investments, including projects in the power sector, e-mobility and electric vehicles, mass transit, trade, industrial processes, and other sectors. In line with administration policy, we will also triple our investments in critical adaptation and resilience projects that help communities cope with the burden of drought, flooding, food scarcity, and other ongoing climate impacts. As DFC's first ever Chief Climate Officer, I look forward to the opportunity to lead DFC's efforts to deliver on our climate commitments and integrate a climate focus throughout all of DFC's lines of operations. I will work with our climate experts to ensure that DFC is reporting on our progress transparently and through credible methodologies. I will also coordinate with interagency colleagues to ensure that DFC's investment tools support a whole of government effort to meet the magnitude of the climate crisis. DFC specializes in supporting commercially viable projects in low and lower middle income countries that meet our investment criteria. The efforts of our sister agencies are key to helping DFC succeed, to identify potential projects, to foster an environment that supports clean energy investment, and to advance research into state-of-the-art and breakthrough innovation that holds the promise of cheap and scalable zero emissions technology. Though the opportunities and potential for climate finance are great, we recognize that there remain instances in developing economies where zero emissions power technology cannot alone meet the energy needs of the very poor and the very disconnected. For that reason, we recognize the need to support the most highly strategic and developmentally impactful projects within the confines of our net zero commitment, and only where clean energy alternatives are not feasible. We believe in the power of climate finance to lift people out of poverty, to provide pathways into good jobs, and to create healthy communities. Our focus on climate at its core is about providing those that aspire to join the growing global middle class with the dignity that they deserve, the dignity that comes with clean air, reliable sources of food and water, and access to electricity. I look forward to sharing more with the committee about DFC's efforts to advance this agenda, and I look forward to addressing your questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Levine. I will start out by asking a couple questions. I think the first question will be directed to Mr. Haney. Both here in the United States and in countries overseas, it's the most vulnerable and marginalized communities that experience the worst effects of environmental degradation and have the least capacity to cope with environmental shocks such as floods or droughts. As I mentioned in my opening statement, women need to be at the center of these climate strategies to make them effective. How is the Office of Global Women's Issues at the State Department going to be involved? I have a bill that would create a point person, such as a senior coordinator for women and global climate change, and mandate a strategy to ensure that these voices don't slip through the cracks. And so I'd like to find out if something like this is being considered. I'll ask my second question also, and then you can respond. And this is to Mr. Harsiger. One of the most anticipated portions, of course, of the president's budget is the $1.2 billion for the Green Climate Fund. So I'd just like for you to briefly catch us up on what has happened with this fund over the past 4 years. And to Mr. Levine, of course, the existential threat of climate change to small islands is well known. While Pacific Island countries are often the focus, countries in the Caribbean also are facing very severe impacts, but these nations are often overlooked. So how will these finance initiatives include small island states and especially in the Caribbean? So Mr. Haney, would you like to start and respond?
Yes, well, thank you. Thank you so much for that question. And as Administrator Power highlighted those very points at the recent G7 meeting, she said, what's true around the world is true at home. The burden of climate change has fallen disproportionately on the backs of these privileged, low-income communities, Black, Brown, Indigenous communities, women, and children. And USAID is strongly committed, working across the entire Bureau, to strengthen the resilience of vulnerable communities. And we look forward to working with Congress to meet the goals of tripling adaptation financing by 2025. I think what's important to note is that women aren't just victims. They are an essential part of the solution to the climate crisis. And that is why USAID has launched a number of targeted programs empowering women to be leaders in driving climate action. These include programs like our Engendering Utilities program, which is supporting 21 countries, supporting women in 21 countries to break into a traditionally male-dominated energy sector. And by the way, not only does it support the women, it's helped to improve the performance of these utilities. Our partnership with NASA under the SEVERE program works to empower women in geospatial and earth sciences and to get actionable climate data to women and girls. And as you noted, we need gender plans and climate action plans. And through our work in the DR, Peru, and Zambia, we've helped to do exactly that, to develop climate change gender action plans as part of their national adaptation plans. So we completely agree that we need a very focused effort. As we develop our climate change strategy, we will be looking across the agency to determine how we continue to expand these efforts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Harsiger.
Thank you, Chairwoman Lee. So for the Green Climate Fund, it has, over the past 4 years, really been focused on improving its capacity to deliver quality projects. And I think, this effort has been focused in two ways. I mean, first of all, they've been, and we as part of the governance in the institution have been focused on ensuring that it has a complete policy framework, that it has a set of policies on things like accountability and transparency that are world-class, and are the things that the U.S. demands from multilateral institutions it participates in. And the second is improving its mechanisms to efficiently deliver projects. And in terms of how it's done on that, I think since it started doing projects in 2015, they've really been able to ramp up delivery. To date, the GCF has approved a total of 173 projects worth over $30 billion, with a bit over $8 billion of its own resources, attracting about $22 billion from other sources. And these projects have been spread throughout the globe. Getting to, connecting to your question to my colleague from USAID, the GCF in its projects is really focused on delivering assistance and financing to the most vulnerable. So it has done 104 projects for small island developing states and least developing countries, the countries who are certainly most at risk from climate change. Then just to note, in terms of the finances of the GCF, when we contributed $1 million in the Obama administration, that went to sort of the first financial period of the GCF. Since then, donors have negotiated a first replenishment of that. The United States did not participate at that time, but other donors decided to contribute $10 billion in that first replenishment. So I think, in addition to success on the ground, other donors are certainly seeing it as a worthwhile vehicle to contribute to. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Levine, we'll come back to you. Hopefully we'll have a second round. I would like to yield now to our ranking member, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Martinez-Diaz, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, the Paris Agreement has no means of enforcement. So while President Biden is imposing burdensome regulations on U.S. businesses that hurt workers, China can carry on growing their economy and expanding their global influence, all while being the world's worst polluter. I read the other day that the U.S. and China have agreed to cooperate on climate change with, quote, seriousness and urgency, quote, as occurred during the Obama administration. I'm very concerned that Beijing believes it can use cooperation on climate change to gain U.S. concessions in other areas. How can you assure this committee that any such cooperation on climate or even discussion of cooperation will not lead to the United States becoming more accommodating of China and her destructive policies in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, or Tibet? And given our strategic competition with China, can you really believe that you can trust the Chinese Communist Party on these matters?
May I go ahead, Chairwoman?
Mr. Martinez-Diaz?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much, Congressman. As Secretary Kerry recently testified in Congress, and the President has made it clear, the administration realizes that we can't solve the climate challenge without China. At the same time, we have obviously strong conflicts with China on a whole variety of issues, including those that you just mentioned. However, the administration's policy is to figure out where we can work with them in a targeted and constructive manner, while at the same time keeping the pressure and managing our conflicts on those other areas. Secretary Kerry has been clear there is no linkage. That is to say, we will not be using trade concessions or concessions in any other issue areas in order to advance our interests on the climate question. We're dealing with the Chinese very much on the climate question alone in a separate track, and that is what Secretary Kerry has been engaged in. This, of course, is going to be very important in order to continue to have this complex relationship with China. But what's clear is we cannot solve the climate challenge if we stop talking to the Chinese. Now, we certainly do not take everything they say at their word. There's significant caution and trust but verify approaches to everything that we're dealing with China on. At the same time, we're working with other countries that do have significant influence with China as well. We're talking to many of our European partners, to Japan, to India, to Australia, in order to ensure that there is pressure from a broad multilateral setting on China. And we're also talking to developing countries, many of whom China cares deeply about. They want to be influential. They want to have global supply chains and global commerce. But many of the countries to whom they sell and with whom they want to have diplomatic relations realize that China is the major emitter now, the major polluter, and there is increasing pressure on China to start behaving responsibly as the largest economy, second largest economy, and the largest emitter. And so we're working with a whole variety of countries to ensure that that pressure begins to really bite, and to ensure that China begins to move in the right direction. There are some early indications that they're willing to do that. They have now said they will be carbon neutral by 2060. That's a new announcement. We don't think it's enough, and we will continue to put pressure to improve their commitments. So I can assure you that we're very, very focused, but we are dealing with this as a separate track.
Madam Chair, I'll wait for a second round.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Ranking Member. Now I will yield to the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Frankel. Good morning.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the our guest panelists today. Good to be with you. And for those of us who do believe that climate change is an existential threat, especially to our future generations, there's an appreciation for these efforts. Of course, my concern is not that you're asking for too much money, but is it going to be enough to get the job done? And so I'm happy to hear that we leverage our dollars as much as possible. My question, and whoever wants to take this, is, it seems like such an overwhelming challenge. What do you think is the best bang for our buck? What kind of efforts? That would be my first question. Does anyone want to add? Mr. Hani, do you want to start with that?
Sure. Well, as you noted, I think as we look at public sector funds, our best bang for our buck is mobilizing private resources. And we have a good template that we have seen from the clean energy sector. Of a decade ago, all clean energy and renewable energy projects were supported essentially at a pilot scale. Now we have seen commercial scale deployment across the world with renewable energy as the least cost option. The resources that have been mobilized far exceed anything we can provide on the public sector side. I think we need to look across the spectrum at our natural climate solutions investments and our adaptation investments, and look how we can similarly attract private investment into these spaces.
Is there an overall strategic plan that you're following, or is it just what looks good? I mean, how are you making the decisions as who to fund, and really what kind of projects do you think are the best bang for the buck?
If I could add a couple of thoughts on this one. So, Congresswoman, I think it depends on whether it's adaptation or mitigation. On adaptation, we find that some of the best investments are those that help communities understand the climate risk they're facing and to manage it. Oftentimes, it's not simply about building the proverbial seawall or improving agricultural practices. It's rather, how do we make sure that those communities understand the risk, are able to manage it through improved information, improved data, and are able to then make decisions, including with their own money, about how to become more resilient. On the mitigation space, I think a lot depends on whether, which country we're talking about, what is the local condition. But in some places, it's all about deploying the existing technologies, right? In some places, it's really, we have the solutions. It's wind, it's solar, it's better grids. And it's just about how do we make sure that those are deployed. In other places where that may not be possible or it's already in place, it's how do we help unlock new technologies that can help reduce emissions.
Anyone want to add to that?
I'd be happy to add to that, Congresswoman Frankel. Thank you for the question. The DFC, as you know, really specializes in partnering with the private sector and with crowding in additional sources of finance that are much greater in magnitude and in scope than what we can provide as a matter of public financing alone. And so, we are hard at work. You asked about sort of what the coordinating strategy is. There is an interagency process now underway to develop an international climate finance strategy and implementing plan, which is being led by the White House and is something to which we are all actively contributing. And it's a plan that is really punctuated by some of the key learnings that we have had in our early experience at DFC in terms of using innovative tools, debt financing, concessional financing, first loss capital, to think about how we can really make what would otherwise seem to be riskier transactions attractive to the private sector, so that we're de-risking using tools like insurance, strategic debt deployment, and working in partnership with private sector investors, institutional investors, pension funds to create sort of blended finance platforms that really work to mobilize a massive amounts of capital to direct at these real challenges.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to yield to Mr. Fortenberry.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm going to ask my question, give a little bit of comment, and then come back to the question because it's broad, but I think it's important. The central question here is how does what we currently fund work together in collaboration for environmental security outcomes, well-being, and stability around the world? How do we collaborate with specific metrics so that we can understand those outcomes? That's a central question. So if I pull back now, is my little commentary, if I pull back and look at this, we have State Department does diplomacy, USAID does development, Treasury has responsibility for a variety of multilateral funds addressing the issues of environmental security, including the Global Environment Facility, which is not a well understood entity, but a very impactful around the world, which we've funded significantly for many years and appropriately so. It's got a bad name. I wish we could rebrand it so it would be better understood, but nonetheless, that's a place where we've planted a flag, and I think that's important. And then now you have the new emerging entity of the DFC to try to, Development Finance Corporation, to try to fill some gaps to make some initial capitalization available so that the private sector can actually function through mitigated risk of use of public dollars. How does what we are doing work together collaboratively on the metrics of environmental security outcomes? What I'm hearing is a lot of parallel tracks that may be oriented toward the same goals, but have quite a bit of overlap. You just mentioned the interagency process. That might be a place to start, but that's my question. How do we collaborate and what are the metrics?
Maybe just if I may, Congressman, jump in from the Treasury perspective. First of all, I mean, I do think we have, as my colleague from DFC mentioned, a very robust interagency process to collaborate between us to figure out how to make our institutions work in complementary ways towards the same goals. And there is the climate finance plan, which we're here to discuss, was an effort to put all that down on paper, and now we're moving towards implementing that, bringing together all the tools that we have. The multilateral tools that the Treasury has oversight over, I think, are an important component of this. The tools that we have, the multilateral development banks, the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Facility, which you mentioned, as well as the climate investment funds, each have their own value adds and things they do a little bit differently. And so we think across the multilateral space, we have different tools that can do different things. And our goal is very much focused on ensuring that what they're doing is complementary and not duplicative, and towards results that we can measure and demonstrate that we are getting value for U.S. taxpayer money. Also then, just to say, we view the multilateral efforts that we oversee at Treasury as very complementary to our bilateral work as well, that USAID oversees, as well as the financing that's done at DFC. These are all tools in the same toolkit to achieve the same answer.
And if I can also jump in on the metrics, Congressman, a very important question. What's happening in many institutions, including the multilateral banks, the Green Climate Fund, USAID, is that we've gotten a lot better at computing so-called co-benefits. That is to say, when there is a project that has a strong climate resilience focus, for example, there's an effort then to measure, well, to what extent is that project also contributing to food security?
Well, this is can I interrupt you for a second because my time is about to run out? This is the core of the question, because this is a holistic question. And if I could divert quickly to Mr. Levine, the DFC representative, because he mentioned agriculture, the regenerative capacity and the possibilities of stabilization for community, as well as new technologies emerging, not only to feed people, but to be an active player in environmental conservation, as it lends itself as well to carbon capture and the other things that we're looking to do, is absolutely critical here. He mentioned a growing portfolio of agricultural projects. I may have to come back to this, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but if you could list those right quick of what you're intending to do and where you're looking at, that would be helpful.
Absolutely. And in light of the time, happy to follow up with you and your team on this, but just as a brief matter, one of the areas where we've had a real bang for our buck, to use Congresswoman Frankel's term, on agriculture projects is investing in small and medium enterprises, particularly in Latin America, Central America. This is a key strategic.
Well, this is also critical to the issue of attacking structural poverty. My time's up, so let's come back to that question. But sorry to interrupt you all, but a lot to talk about here. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to yield to Ms. Torres.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to our panelists. Chairwoman Lee, thank you for this report that you have requested from the Congressional Research Office. I've had an opportunity to review it. I'm really concerned about relationship building with these countries, specifically where we are seeing a large number of refugees coming from. The Trump administration sees providing financial assistance to developing countries for activities defined as related to climate change. Fiscal year 2018 budget blueprint released on March 16th, 2017 indicated that the administration would pursue a policy that eliminates the Global Climate Change Initiative and fulfills the president's pledge to cease payments to the United Nations climate change programs by eliminating all funding. So, you know, we've had 4 years of destroying this policy. Now we have to build it up. We've talked about the different programs. We've talked about quasi-private sector assistance involvement in dealing with these issues. What we haven't talked about is how does now the new Biden administration's commitment to dealing with this issue as it relates to refugees, not just cleaning up the air, but as it relates to refugees. Can you point to me how USAID will be dealing with the $310 million that was recently announced for humanitarian relief to address food insecurity and other programs? How are the people that are mostly impacted by these natural disasters see themselves in that relief program? So when we're working to rebuild bridges, infrastructure, housing that has been destroyed by, you know, volcano eruptions and hurricanes and all of that, you know, the locals often find themselves working side by side, unpaid workers working side by side with paid crews, construction crews. So we should not be surprised that then they have no option other than to flee and come to our southern border. So how are you going to make sure that, number one, when we are looking to allocate aid, that we look to create job opportunities for the people most impacted by them? And what are some of those challenges? And don't tell me that the lack of training, because we can create job training programs to ensure that they are meeting you know, the needs of those jobs. Come on, don't all jump in at the same time. Let's start with USAID.
Thank you very much for that question. And maybe we could walk through a couple concrete examples of what we're doing and how it's realizing impact on the ground. And in Guatemala and Honduras, USAID works with smallholder farmers directly in areas of high outmigration to increase.
Okay, but part of the problem is that we are incentivizing the types of crops that are not culturally appropriate to the dietary needs of the people. So the people themselves can't even afford to eat the food that they're growing. Palm oil seems to be a big problem. We're not addressing the issues of damming up rivers and lakes that, the water that is needed to get into these little towns in order for these small farmers to grow the food that they need to eat.
Well, thank you. And, USAID is focused specifically on those issues. We're working to reduce post-harvest loss. So it's trying to absolutely increase incomes with locally appropriate crops. We're looking at crops that are more drought tolerant. So I believe that our programs are very effectively targeting these very issues which you're addressing. We're working with coffee farmers.
Some really great programs, and I'm your biggest cheerleader here in Congress, but I also have to call a spade a spade. And some of these NGOs that we work with, they have a mindset of the types of crops that they want to promote in certain regions. And oftentimes, that is just not culturally appropriate to the nutrition needs of the people there. So we have to think in those terms. And my time has ran out, but I hope that we can come back at some point.
Now I would like to yield to Mr. Rushenthaler.
Thanks, Chairwoman Lee. I really appreciate it. I had a few questions, but I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about what Ranking Member Rogers elicited from testimony. So let me just revisit that. Ms. Martina-Diaz, from my understanding, when you were talking to the Ranking Member, you said that foreign assistance programs like the Green Climate Fund will actually not reduce, by itself, it will not reduce greenhouse emissions. It will do nothing to reduce climate change, unless bigger polluters like China will also reduce their emissions. Is that correct?
What I meant to say, Congressman, is that we need China as part of the solution because they're almost 30% of global emissions, but we also need all the other countries that are smaller shares, but collectively represent the bulk of emissions. So we need everybody to do their part.
Right, but if China doesn't do anything, then what we do is pretty much for naught. Even if we continue to reduce our CO2 emissions, which we were doing before the pandemic, if China continues to pollute at a 3 times rate where we're polluting, all these efforts are for naught. And I'm not advocating that we do nothing. I just want to make sure we got our facts straight, that without China's cooperation, we're going nowhere in this climate change battle, correct?
What I would say is that China's willingness and ability to move also depends on what others do. So as more and more, so China wants to be a world power, right? They want to be influential around the world. They want to have friends in many places, including their own region. However, many of those countries are the ones getting it directly from the impacts of climate change. And they're increasingly starting to realize that China is not doing enough and that China is part of the problem, not the solution. And so as we work with other countries to get them to be responsible, to reduce their emissions, the pressure is building on China to do more. So these things are connected. It's not just a one-stop shop there.
All right, so I'll take it that, yes, we can't do anything globally unless China comes on board. And then to your own admission, you said that there are actually no enforcement mechanisms of the Paris Climate Accord regarding China, right? That there's zero enforcement mechanisms in that deal.
Well, we negotiated an agreement that partly because of our insistence as the United States relies heavily on voluntary commitments by all countries, including the US, right? And
right.
That means that we do have to report. That is an obligation under the agreement. We all have to say what we're doing and how we're doing it. But a lot of the enforcement really depends on our ability to work together with others and to put pressure on others through example and through other means so that we can all achieve those targets.
Right. So we have no enforcement mechanisms. We just have basically well wishes and empty promises by the Chinese Communist Party. So, for example, the Chinese Communist Party is not even saying that they'll reduce their emissions to what, 2060?
No, they've said that they will reach neutrality, that is to say net zero emissions by 2060. They can't get there unless they start doing stuff today, because it's a long curve that you need to bend. And so they would need to start now. And that's why we're taking them, every time they make those kinds of commitments, we immediately jump and say, okay, well, show us how you're going to do it. What are the midterm targets that you're trying to put in place? Show us the plan. Otherwise, we can't take this seriously.
So then, am I missing something? Have they started to reduce their emissions? Because you sound very optimistic. I mean, how much have they reduced in the last 5 years?
All I'm saying is that in order to get to their own commitment of 2016 net zero, they need to start now. So we're asking them, please show us what is your plan, and we keep asking questions about how they're going to do it. At the same time, we're pushing them hard not to just stop at 2016 net zero. We would like them to do it a lot earlier. In the US, we've announced a target of net zero by 2050. So we would like China to be at least at that level.
But you're aware that they're greatly increasing their CO2 emissions, right? I mean, you realize that what you're saying is a fantasy, that they're not only are they not reducing their CO2 emissions, that while they're giving you these pie in the sky dreams, they're actually increasing their CO2 emissions. Like, you know that, right?
Well, the key is they continue to grow in terms of emissions, but they're beginning to put in place a set of policies that will help bend the curve over time. For example, they've announced a major cap and trade system, which is now being put in place in China, right? Slowly. It's a big oil tanker. You can't turn that around overnight. But we want
so just to get this straight, Beijing is promising to reduce their emissions. At the same time, they're increasing their emissions, but they're telling the Biden administration that they are going to make their best efforts to reduce and go to zero by 2060. And the Biden administration is buying that nonsense. It seems to me that Beijing is playing Biden like an absolute fiddle here. And the fact that you are telling me with a straight face that you believe this, I don't know if it's laughable. I don't know if it goes to your competence, but any rational person listening to this is not believing what you're saying.
Look, Congressman, we don't take what China tells us at face value on any issue. Right? We always have a very clear process for verifying. We push them in every negotiation, in every table, to show us the plan, to have accountability. We're putting in place systems that are increasingly better at telling us who is emitting what. So it's not just about taking people at their word. So no, we're not trusting anybody in this game. We want an accountable system with transparency. But what I'm saying is that China is beginning to change its perspectives, and we have to take them. We have to accept that they're willing to do that, but then ask for the transparency and the accountability while we put pressure on them through other means, through other alliances, and through other parties.
Okay,
right.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Chairwoman. I yield back. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now I'll yield to Ms. Ming.
Sorry.
Can you unmute? Okay.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you to our witnesses for being here. My first question, I want to echo Chairwoman Lee's concerns that while climate change impacts every country, just like any other national security or humanitarian threat, it disproportionately impacts those who are already most vulnerable. This is particularly true of women and girls in communities reeling from natural disasters. Climate change, just like other emergency humanitarian situations, exacerbates and aggravates gender-based violence. In the aftermath of a natural disaster, there are gaps in services and humanitarian protection frameworks, which can make it difficult to adequately prevent gender-based violence and mitigate its impact. For example, in the aftermath of the Gizo tsunami in the Solomon Islands in 2007, increased rates of gender-based violence, including rape, were reported. 3 members of this subcommittee, myself, Ms. Franco, and Mr. Diaz-Balart, have introduced the Safe from the Start Act, which would codify programs that ensure quality services for survivors from the very onset of these emergencies. Wanted to ask how our state and USAID's climate change policies, considering the unique protection needs for women and girls in the aftermath of natural disasters, and to what extent are your offices working with other bureaus or agencies to address the aftermath of natural disasters, including gender-based violence?
Well, thank you very much for that question, Congresswoman. And certainly we've seen disasters amplify existing inequalities and vulnerabilities for marginalized groups. that due to extreme poverty, living in climate vulnerable regions, and dependence on natural resources for livelihoods. USAID, as we embark on our new climate strategy, which we have committed to complete in a 6 months time, has convened leadership across the agency, making sure that we bring in the perspective of the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, and that we are not only looking at humanitarian assistance programming as we look to address the climate crisis. And certainly with that type of leadership, we believe that our strategy will put us in a much stronger place to address these type of challenges moving forward.
Thank you. Would love to continue working with all of you on that. My second question, I know I'm pressed for time. It's about climate-related water scarcity. Just wanting to know what steps are your offices taking to address climate-related water scarcity in international development efforts, and specifically, how are the Bureau of Development, Democracy and Innovation, and DFC working with the private sector to support innovative technology that can more easily produce potable water out of contaminated water sources?
Allow me to jump in, Congresswoman Meng, thank you for this question. And first, let me just say that while in the case of sort of post-disaster relief, DFC typically comes in later, we do recognize that those are the moments where gender-based violence is of greatest concern, and we are also working with the tools that we have available to us to learn how we can be a meaningful contributor to relief in those scenarios. So for example, we're in the early stages of establishing a technical assistance facility to help our clients and partners address broader gender-based issues, including gender-based violence. As it comes to the issue of water scarcity, we are working actively with the private sector, in particular with small and medium enterprises that provide services around adaptation and resilience measures broadly, but also with a specific focus on water scarcity and drought resilience. This is an area where we have committed to generally tripling our investments, and we really look forward to working with you and your team to refine our approach.
Great, thank you. I yield back.
Okay, thank you. Now I'd like to yield to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Espaillat. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question goes to Mr. Martinez Diaz or Hasselgager. On March 1st, myself and 40 other of my colleagues wrote to the administration urging for a $4 billion fiscal year 22 commitment to the Green Climate Fund, the world's premier mitigation and adaptation climate financing institution. This will pay off our $2 billion debt from 2014 and begin a new round of payments, which our global allies began in 2019. President Biden's fiscal year 22 summary budget request includes a $1.2 billion ask for the Green Climate Fund. And while a significant step forward, I believe it fails to meet the challenge of this day. In 2019, our global partners doubled their initial pledges, meaning if we fall in line with them, we will need to pledge an additional $6 billion by 2023. The $1.2 billion layout by the administration doesn't even cover our existing debt, let alone set us on a path to be in line with our global partners. So the question is, does the administration plan to make a new pledge to the Green Climate Fund of $6 billion? And what is the administration's plan to make up the rest of our outstanding debt? Mr. Martinez or Mr. Harsager?
Let me kick it off, Congressman. Thank you for the question. So the GCF, as you mentioned, is a really important part of the climate finance architecture. It's not the only part, but it's obviously a very important one. And so what we wanted to do was to provide a very important down payment on the $2 billion that is outstanding from the Obama administration. At the same time, to make sure that we had enough left over for significant increases in other parts of the system. So overall, the administration is asking for $2.5 billion overall for different parts of the climate finance landscape here. And then, of course, there's the President Biden's commitment to double overall and by 2024 and to triple the adaptation component. If we are able to get from Congress what the administration has requested on climate finance, we will be very well on the way to doubling by 2024. And so we'll look forward to working with you closely to make sure we can get that. On GCF,
we're not on path with our global partners. They seem to be doing better than us, and so
certainly some are, sir. I think Germany and the UK, for example, have been very good. Given the size of their economy, they have been more ambitious. There's no question, and we need to get there, and we would like to get there. We realize that we can't go from. Recall that during the Trump years, the climate finance collapsed by 50%. So we're digging up from a significant hole, and we want to make sure we can ramp up quickly. We're just concerned about our ability to do that from one year to the next. Because if we're unable to do that, then we will look, our credibility could be in question. So we want to make sure that we have a strong, ambitious, but achievable level of finance. And so we're hoping that the $1.25 billion will put us on that step. We'll be able to pay off our full debt by 23 if we are able to secure these funds. And then we'll be in a very good place to then make a significant pledge in the future, as you alluded to.
My last question is, I know I'm running out of time, Madam Chair. When do you think the U.S. will reach a point where 50% of the climate finance it provides will be for adaptation? I mean, when do you think we'll be there, any of you?
If I can start that, I think the crucial question is how do we improve the balance right now between mitigation and adaptation? I think overall, we're not spending enough on everything, as you pointed out. We probably are not spending nearly enough on adaptation in particular. The needs are urgent. The communities are suffering now. That's why the president committed to tripling adaptation finance by 24, even as we double, right? So you can already see that we're doubling overall, but we're tripling adaptation, meaning we're starting to shift the balance already. I can't give you a precise date by which we would hit that 50% mark, or whether even it makes sense to have such a kind of mathematical approach to this. What is clear to the administration is we need to do much more on adaptation, and we're beginning to do that through that tripling pledge.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Okay, members and witnesses, we're going to go to our second round, but we're going to ask everyone to keep your time to 3 minutes. There were many subcommittee hearings taking place now. So we'll do another round with 3 minutes apiece. I'd like to continue with Mr. Levine with regard to the Caribbean and finance initiatives. You know, while these islands face real challenges, they also have tremendous opportunities. And how can we help these islands' economies use their biodiversity and renewable energy resources to their advantage? And how is our assistance supporting these island countries in their efforts to overcome these challenges? And what kind of a focus do we have in terms of the Caribbean, in terms of our overall engagement on climate?
Thank you, Chairwoman. Just a few thoughts there. As a starting matter, 30% of DFC's portfolio is presently at work in Latin America and the Caribbean. We are intent on increasing the portion that is going to the Caribbean specifically. And that's in large part because, as you know, the Caribbean is particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, both in terms of sea level rise, hurricane and storm intensity. So we feel it's ripe for further investment, especially on this question of climate adaptation and resilience projects. One of the ways that we are working to source more opportunities is by engaging with stakeholders on the ground. Just in the last couple of months, we held a stakeholder town hall in Port-au-Prince. And we've also recently invested in a number of loan portfolio guarantee funds that focus on deploying funds to small and medium enterprises, really shoring up financial markets for clean energy and adaptation and resilience, because we know that that's a key piece of growing the overall work that we're doing.
Okay.
And
Would anyone else like to comment on that? Because I know all of you have some part of this as it relates to the island nations of the Caribbean.
Yes, I'd like to comment on behalf of USAID that we've got a robust portfolio in the climate space. On the clean energy side, we're about to launch a $25 million Caribbean Energy Initiative. That's going to support countries like Barbados that have set ambitious 2030 targets to transition from heavy fuel oil to diesel and diesel to renewable energy. And it's going to focus very intently on improving the resilience of energy systems in the face of ever-increasing storms. And then we're also working in Jamaica and other islands to support climate adaptation and mobilize climate finance.
Thank you very much. Now, and I'd like to follow up with all of you specifically about the Caribbean islands and your jurisdiction and the specifics in terms of what we're doing in terms of financing the climate projects. I will yield now to our ranking member, Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Levine, the DFC was created in large part to push back against China's predatory lending policies under the Belt and Road Initiative. It was envisioned as a key tool in the great power competition, with the possibility of unlocking tremendous economic development abroad by giving developing countries an alternative to the debt trap diplomacy of the Chinese Communist Party. It seems this administration has chosen to use the unique authorities provided to you by Congress prominently in their climate agenda. My opening remarks probably tipped you off on how I view these issues, but as a supporter of the DFC, I'm particularly concerned about the possibility of your agency getting off task. How can the DFC continue with its objectives of countering Chinese influence with the most appropriate type of investments when so much of your program has been predetermined to focus on climate change through arbitrary targets?
Thank you, Ranking Member, for that question. And I would say that I think that we are in large agreement on this issue. As you know, the US and China take different approaches in terms of development, and China has spent hundreds of billions of dollars on infrastructure projects around the world using coercive techniques to drive spending and debt traps, particularly in strategic regions that we would like to be in as well. But we take a different approach. We partner with the private sector. We do not employ exploitative labor practices, and we catalyze additional investment using the free market to crowd in private finance. And I would offer that clean energy provides a unique opportunity to accomplish this mission. This is where the private sector is moving. There have been record investments in clean energy, from renewable energy sources to zero emission vehicles, to clean industrial processes such as the production of hydrogen and low carbon materials like cement. And if we are going to compete and win in the 21st century economy, we need to continue investing in those resources. But I would just emphasize that the US and China really have a different approach on this. Our hope is that our partner countries around the world, other democracies, allies, will find a non-couple and attractive option than the one that China offers.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. Let me see. I know Representative Franco, I don't see her on the screen, so now I will yield to Representative Torres.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jeff, if we can go back to the point I was trying to get you to make, and that is related to creating job opportunities for the people that are most impacted, by these natural disasters. I mean, I've seen really good programs in South America, in Trujillo specifically, USAID program, a little town of mostly women who you tasked to build their own homes, gave them the materials, all of the lumber and supplies that they needed, and they were able to do that working side by side with other people. So how can we duplicate programs like that, where the locals are seeing a future for themselves integrated in these jobs that are being created?
Well, it's an absolutely essential component of success on our climate agenda. And I can provide another example in Colombia, where USAID supported the government to establish their own domestic carbon markets. What we've seen since that was established is $20 million of revenue flowing to indigenous and Afro-Colombian communities, so that they are, in fact, as you note, realizing the upside of protecting forests rather than destroying it. So I think these are exactly the type of models that we need to explore globally to make sure that the benefits are accruing to those most vulnerable.
Yes, and in Chile, the former president committed to me $20 million for infrastructure improvements to roads that lead to indigenous populations. I don't know if that project was ever completed. You know, we haven't not been able to travel to the region. So I've seen some really good projects in partnerships with other countries, but I don't see that coming out of the Northern Triangle. And I hope that, you know, we have very limited time, but that we can follow up to ensure that the language that I'm working on for our appropriations bill that requires local hires, that requires job training programs as we help to rebuild in these areas, that continues to be at the very top of our agenda.
Well, thank you so much for your leadership on these issues, and USAID will look forward to working with you.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I will yield now to Mr. Fortenberry.
Thank you again, Madam Chair. This is a great, important discussion. I want to build on some of the comments that Ranking Member Rogers has made. Listen, China is on the march. They have a hybrid capitalistic communistic system that directly subsidizes industry. They have lax labor standards, lax environmental standards. And so, for instance, in Beijing, it takes 5 years off your life if you live there because the air is so polluted. A group of business people recently said to us, these are American businesses looking to invest in Central America. They found that labor and environmental costs add 60% to their bottom line. This is in Central America versus going to China. China pushes these externality costs onto the world, onto us, and then we're expected to clean it up. So while we are doing the righteous, noble thing here, an appropriate thing, nonetheless, this issue of holding China accountable, why don't we hold China accountable to international environmental standards in all trade agreements and other agreements? And then I'll give you a very specific example of the unfairness of this all. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a big proponent of the Global Environment Facility. I think they do tremendous work across a spectrum of environmental issues. We fund them significantly, and properly so. China has a seat at their governing table. China basically contributes nothing to it, but lives off, again, our effort. The key consideration, one of the key considerations here is, of course, a number of the good things you're doing, particularly in terms of development finance and special projects of grant making that advance environmental security, but also this issue of holding China accountable. I'd like the panel, Madam Chair, to respond to that, please.
If I may start, I think, Congressman, the issue of China doing its fair share is really important. On the finance piece, we've pushed, at least since the Obama years, for China to also play a role as a provider of climate finance, not just as a user of it. Over time, I think the pressure is beginning to work. Back in 2015, China committed $3.1 billion to a South-South fund for climate cooperation. However, we are not entirely convinced that that money really was dispersed. So we'll keep pushing on that. We intend to make sure that China is a member, is a contributor as part of the Paris Agreement conversations in terms of money. And I think it's increasingly clear for them that they can't simply be the largest emitter and not provide any money.
Well, obviously I'm asking my question and trying to be in solidarity with you and the responsible community of nations to continue to basically hold China accountable here. But let me pivot very quickly back to Mr. Levine. List the agricultural projects you're working on.
Thank you, Congressman. I had begun to mention a series of projects. For example, we just launched a 1 acre fund to support smallholder farmers, the majority of whom, by the way, are women. 1 acre has built.
Glad you took up our initiative on that. Yeah, we've been working on that. I'm out of time. Look forward to continuing that dialogue with you, though. Thank you so much, Madam Chair.
I'd very much welcome the chance to
All right.
conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being with us today. I want to thank you all for your time and your testimony. This was a very enlightening and important hearing. We all have a great responsibility ahead of us to not just act quickly, but to act wisely in order that U.S. diplomacy and financing effectively address the climate crisis. Finally, if members have questions that they would like to submit for the record, please submit them to the subcommittee within the next 7 days. And I'm sure to all our witnesses that members will definitely follow up with you with additional questions and hopefully additional interaction with you. And so this concludes today's hearing. And I want to once again thank you very much. The State and Foreign Operations and Related Programs hearing stands adjourned. Thank you all again.